Dust filled the air as a lone rider crested the hill overlooking the Wyoming Valley. He paused, scanning the horizon with eyes that had seen too much death. Everett Donovan adjusted his worn cavalry hat, shielding his face from the relentless summer sun. 7 years since the war had ended, but some battles never stopped raging inside him. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw tightened as he squinted at movement in the distance. Something, or someone, was stumbling across the drought-stricken plains. He clicked his tongue, urging his horse forward. As he drew closer, the figure took shape. A young woman, barely more than a girl, staggering forward with desperate determination. Her dress was torn and stained with blood. No shoes on her feet, hair matted with dust and sweat. She moved like a wounded animal, running on nothing but fear and will. Everett slowed his approach, keeping a careful distance. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers who'd lost everything but weren't ready to die. The dangerous kind of desperation. The girl collapsed, her body surrendering even as her spirit fought to rise again. Everett dismounted, approaching with the caution of someone who knew how cornered creatures could bite. "Miss," he called, his voice rough from disuse. "You need help?" She jerked her head up, eyes wild with terror. Blood streaked her face, whether her own or someone else's, he couldn't tell. She tried to crawl backward, leaving crimson smudges on the parched earth. "Please." Her voice cracked like the dry ground beneath them. "Don't take it." Everett stopped, recognizing the tone. He'd heard it in field hospitals, from men who'd lost limbs but begged doctors not to take more, from women in burned towns clutching the last of their possessions. "I'm not taking anything from you," he said, slowly removing his canteen. He placed it on the ground between them, and then stepped back, giving her space. "You need water more than you need fear." For a long moment, she stared at the canteen as if it might be poison. The wind whispered through the tall grass around them, carrying the scent of dust and distant thunderstorms. Finally, thirst overcame suspicion. She grabbed the canteen, drinking in desperate gulps until water spilled down her chin. "Easy," Everett cautioned. "Too fast will make you sick." She lowered the canteen, studying him with wary eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "Who are you?" "Everett Donovan. This is my land you're on." He gestured to the modest ranch house visible in the distance. "And you?" "Margaret," she answered after a hesitation. "Margaret Calloway." The name meant nothing to Everett, but the way she guarded it told him it might mean something to others, something dangerous. "Can you walk, Miss Calloway? My ranch isn't far." She tried to stand but faltered. Without asking permission, Everett moved forward and helped her up, noting how she flinched at his touch. "I won't hurt you," he said simply. Margaret said nothing, but it allowed him to help her onto his horse. As they made their way to the ranch house, Everett felt her trembling against him, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something haunted. The ranch was modest, a weathered two-story house with a small barn and corral, no fancy trimmings, nothing to suggest prosperity, just the bare necessities of survival on the frontier. A home built for practicality, not comfort. Inside, the house spoke volumes about its owner. Sparse furnishings, a bookshelf with medical texts and history books, a carefully maintained rifle above the fireplace, and in the corner, half hidden behind a curtain, a Union Army uniform coat, folded with military precision. Margaret noticed it as Everett helped her to a chair at the kitchen table. "You fought." It wasn't a question, but Everett nodded anyway. 32nd Pennsylvania, field surgeon. He poured water into a basin and found a clean cloth. "Your wounds need tending." Margaret tensed. "I can manage." "Suit yourself." He placed the basin before her, along with the cloth and a small bottle. "Iodine, for infection." He turned his back, offering privacy. "I'll find you something clean to wear." While she cleaned her wounds, Everett rummaged through an old trunk, eventually producing a faded dress. "Was my wife's," he said when he returned, eyes fixed on the floor. "Should fit well enough." Margaret studied him with new understanding. The empty house, the single chair pulled up to the table, the way he spoke of his wife in past tense. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting the dress. Everett nodded curtly. "There's a room upstairs you can use. First door on the right." He moved toward the door. "I'll see to the evening chores. You rest." Left alone, Margaret carefully explored her temporary sanctuary. The room was plain but clean. with a narrow bed and a small window overlooking the endless Wyoming prairie. A Bible sat on the bedside table, well worn from frequent reading. She changed quickly, wincing as the fabric settled over her wounds. The dress hung loose on her frame, but it was clean and whole, more than could be said for anything else in her life now. As the sun began to set, Margaret stood at the window watching Everett move around the corral. His actions were precise, economical. A man who wasted neither motion nor emotion. She wondered what had shaped him into this solitary figure. War, certainly. Loss, obviously. But there was something else there. Something vigilant and she touched the small leather pouch hidden beneath her borrowed dress, making sure it was still secure against her skin. Inside was the only thing she had left from her father. The only thing worth dying for, or killing for. "They'll come looking," she whispered to herself. "They always do." Night fell across the prairie like a heavy blanket. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of the house, floorboards creaking as Everett moved below, the distant howl of a coyote, the persistent Wyoming wind brushing against the walls. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lancaster burning, heard her mother's screams, felt her father's blood, still warm as he pressed something into her hand and whispered his final words. "Never give it to anyone, Margaret. They'll never stop." A noise outside jarred her from the memory. Cautiously, she moved to the window. In the silver moonlight, she saw Everett standing by the fence, staring into the distance. His rifle rested against his shoulder, and his posture suggested he wasn't simply enjoying the night air. He was standing guard. For the first time since Lancaster, Margaret felt something other than terror. Not safety. She knew better than to believe in safety now, but something adjacent to it. A temporary reprieve. She watched him for a long while, this stranger who had offered help without demanding explanation. In her experience, men always wanted something in return. What did Everett Donovan want? Or was he simply what he appeared to be, a lonely veteran with his own ghosts to battle? As if sensing her gaze, Everett turned and looked up at her window. Their eyes met across the darkness. Neither smiled nor waved. Just a silent acknowledgement of two people awake in the night, each carrying their own burdens. Margaret stepped back from the window and finally allowed herself to sit on the bed. Her hand went to the pouch around her neck, fingers working at the tight knot. When it finally came loose, she carefully removed its contents. Not the gold nugget or map that Silas Redwood's men had been convinced she carried. Just a photograph, creased and worn from being pressed against her skin during her desperate flight. The image showed two men standing side by side outside a military tent. One was her father, Edwin Calloway, younger and more carefree than she'd ever known him. Beside him stood a younger man with similar features. The family resemblance, unmistakable despite the different surnames. On the back, written in her father's neat hand, "Two brothers, one choice, 1862. She stared at the face of the younger man, a face she'd seen again 7 days ago, hardened by time and hatred, as he ordered his men to burn her home with her family inside. The face of Silas Redwood, who had once been someone else entirely. Margaret's hands trembled as she tucked the photograph back into its pouch. Her father's final secret was now hers to bear, along with the knowledge that her family hadn't died for gold or land or any of the usual reasons people killed in the West. They had died because of blood, because of choices made long ago, because some wounds never heal. She secured the pouch around her neck again and lay down, knowing sleep would still evade her. But she needed to rest, to regain her strength, because Silas Redwood would come, and when he did, she needed to be ready. Morning brought the smell of coffee and bacon. Margaret descended the stairs cautiously, her body stiff from yesterday's ordeal. She found Everett at the stove, his movements efficient as he turned the bacon in the pan. "Sit," he said without looking up. "You need to eat." Margaret obeyed, watching him with quiet assessment. In the clear light of morning, she could better see the toll life had taken on him. Hair graying at the temples, lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the scar on his face puckered in white against his sun-darkened skin. "Thank you," she said as he placed a plate before her. "For everything." Everett nodded, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "Where you headed?" he asked, sitting across from her. Margaret hesitated. "I don't know yet. Running from something or to something. Both, maybe. He didn't press further, just nodded as if her vague answer had confirmed something. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of forks against plates and the distant lowing of cattle. Whatever brought you here, Everett finally said, it's still out there. I'm guessing it doesn't give up easy. Margaret set down her fork. No, it doesn't. You got people waiting somewhere, family, friends? She looked away, swallowing hard. Not anymore. Everett absorbed this information with a slight nod. You can stay until you figure things out. The world won't be any kinder tomorrow, but you'll face it stronger. Before Margaret could respond, Everett's head snapped toward the window. He rose silently, moving to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. His entire demeanor changed in an instant, from quiet host to coiled predator. Someone's coming, he said, his voice low. Single rider. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. They found me. We don't know that yet. Everett checked the rifle's chamber. Go upstairs. Stay quiet. Don't come down unless I call. She hesitated, torn between flight and something more dangerous. Trust. Go, Everett repeated, more firmly this time. Margaret hurried upstairs but couldn't resist peering through the bedroom window. A lone horseman approached the ranch at a casual pace that somehow seemed more menacing than a gallop. Even from a distance, she recognized the distinctive red bandana and wide-brimmed hat. Clayton Reed, Redwood's most loyal gunman. Below, she heard the front door open and close as Everett stepped onto the porch. The house's structure prevented her from seeing him, but she could imagine his stance, casual yet alert. Rifle held, not quite pointed at the visitor, but ready. Morning, came a voice from outside, smooth as snake oil. Fine day for riding. Private property, Everett replied, his tone neutral but firm. Just passing through, friend, looking for someone. Young lady, dark hair, might be injured. Seen anyone matching that description? There was a pause, long enough for Margaret's heart to skip several beats. Many folks pass through these parts, Everett said finally. Most mind their business. I do the same. This girl stole something valuable. Boss is mighty upset. That's so? The disinterest in Everett's voice sounded genuine even to Margaret's ears. What did she take? Family heirloom. Sentimental value, you understand. Another pause. Margaret pressed closer to the window, straining to hear. On my land, Everett's voice hardened subtly. I'm judge, jury, and executioner. Any man hunting women through my property better have more than sentimental value as reason. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Clayton Reed laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just being neighborly, asking questions. No harm meant. A pause. I'll be moving on then. But if you do see her, there's reward money. Boss pays well for loyalty. I've been paid for my loyalty before, Everett said. Found it wasn't worth the price. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Margaret waited until she heard Everett come back inside before descending the stairs. He stood at the window, watching Reed's departure, rifle still in hand. He'll be back, Margaret said. With others. Everett nodded. Figured as much. He turned to her, eyes assessing. Time you told me what kind of trouble I've invited into my home. Margaret took a deep breath. How much could she safely share? How much did she even understand herself? My father was Edwin Calloway, she began. We lived in Lancaster, up north. He was... She hesitated, the lie her family had lived behind, sticking in her throat. Everyone thought he was a mining engineer. We had a good life there. Normal. She touched the pouch around her neck. A week ago, men came. Redwood's gang. They... Her voice faltered. They killed my parents, my little brother. Burned our home. They were looking for something they thought my father had. What were they really looking for? Everett asked, catching the hesitation in her story. Margaret met his gaze. I don't know exactly, but they believe I have it. Her hand tightened around the pouch. My father gave me this before he died, told me never to give it to anyone. May I see it? She tensed. I'm not asking you to give it to me, Everett clarified, just to show me what men are willing to kill for. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret removed the pouch and extracted the photograph. She held it out, watching Everett's face carefully. He took it gingerly, studying the image. His expression remained impassive, but Margaret noticed his knuckles whitening slightly as he gripped the photograph. You know them, she said. It wasn't a question. Everett looked up, and for the first time she saw something crack in his carefully maintained facade. I knew them, he corrected quietly. A lifetime ago. He turned the photograph over, reading the inscription on the back. Two brothers, one choice. He handed it back to Margaret. Your father never told you about his brother? I didn't know he had one. Everett moved to the window again, staring out at the vast prairie. The war changed a lot of men, some for better, some for worse. He turned back to her, and some it broke apart entirely. The younger man in that photograph, Margaret pressed, he's Silas Redwood now. He's the one who ordered my family killed. Everett was silent for a long moment. Daniel, he said finally. His name was Daniel Calloway, your uncle. The word felt foreign to Margaret, uncle, family she never knew existed. Why would he kill his own brother? His family? That, said Everett grimly, is what we need to find out. He checked his rifle again, a habitual motion. But first we need to make sure you can protect yourself. Reed won't come alone next time. He moved to the door. Can you shoot? Margaret thought of the hours her father had spent teaching her, his insistence that she learn despite her mother's objections, the way he'd praised her natural talent. Yes, she answered. I can shoot. Good, Everett nodded, because before this is over, I suspect you'll need to. The rifle felt familiar in Margaret's hands, its weight comforting in a world where everything else had been torn away. Everett had set up targets along the fence, tin cans and bottles arranged at various distances. Show me, he said simply. Margaret raised the rifle, settling it against her shoulder as her father had taught her. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The nearest can flew off the fence post. Without pause, she shifted aim and fired again. And again. 5 shots, 5 targets down. The last one had been nearly 100 yards away. She lowered the rifle to find Everett watching her with newfound respect. And something else. Suspicion, perhaps. Your father taught you well, he observed. He said the world wouldn't be gentle to a Calloway, Margaret replied, reloading the rifle with practiced ease. I never understood why until now. Everett took the rifle, checking it over. Most men don't teach their daughters to shoot like that. He handed it back. Most mining engineers don't shoot like that themselves. Margaret met his gaze steadily. You think my father wasn't what he claimed to be? I think very few men are exactly what they claim. He gestured toward the targets. Again, but faster this time. They spent the morning at target practice, Everett correcting her stance occasionally, but mostly observing. By noon, Margaret's shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing, but she felt more centered than she had since Lancaster. As they walked back to the house, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been brewing since she'd shown him the photograph. How did you know them? My father and Daniel. Everett's pace slowed. 32nd Pennsylvania. Like I said, your father was a lieutenant, smart man, educated. Daniel was his younger brother, followed him into service. I was assigned as their unit surgeon. His voice grew distant with memory. We saw action at Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg. And after the war? After the war, men went their separate ways. Some couldn't leave the fighting behind, others couldn't face what they'd become. He glanced at her. I lost track of your father, heard rumors he'd gone west, started fresh. Margaret sensed he wasn't telling the whole story. And Daniel? When did he become Silas Redwood? That, said Everett grimly, is something I've been trying to figure out for 7 years. They reached the house, but instead of going inside, Everett led her to a small grave marked by a simple wooden cross behind the property. Wildflowers grew around it, carefully tended. Rebecca, he said, answering Margaret's unspoken question. My wife. I'm sorry, Margaret offered, noting the dates carved into the cross. 7 years ago. Redwood's gang came through these parts back then, looking for something. Or someone. His voice hardened. Rebecca was alone when they found her. I was in town, getting supplies. The parallels to Margaret's story hung in the air between them. That's why you helped me, she realized. You've been hunting them too. Everett didn't confirm or deny it. He just stood there, looking at his wife's grave with eyes that had seen too much death to be shocked by it anymore. There's a storm coming, he said finally, glancing at the darkening sky. Best get inside. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Margaret found herself unable to sleep again. The house creaked and groaned under the assault of wind and water. Through her door, she heard Everett moving about downstairs, his footsteps too regular for sleep. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she descended the stairs to find him seated at the kitchen table, cleaning his rifle by lamplight. He looked up at her approach but didn't seem surprised. "Storm keeping you awake?" "Memories," she corrected, settling into the chair across from him. "They're louder at night." Everett nodded understanding. He reached for a second cup, pouring coffee from the pot he kept warm on the stove. He slid it across to her without asking if she wanted it. "Did you find them?" Margaret asked after a while. "The men who killed your wife?" His hand stilled on the rifle. "Some, but not Redwood." "Not yet?" Margaret studied him in the lamplight, seeing the years of pain and purpose etched into his face. "What will you do when you find him?" "What needs doing?" They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room in harsh white light. Thunder followed, so close it rattled the windows. "There's something you're not telling me," Margaret said finally. "About my father, about what's in this photograph." Everett reassembled his rifle with methodical precision. "There are some truths that aren't mine to tell. My father is dead, my mother is dead, my brother and the dead." Margaret's voice was steady despite the pain behind her words. "If there are truths about why, I deserve to know them." Everett regarded her for a long moment. "Your father was more than a mining engineer, so was Daniel. They designed weapons during the war." Margaret blinked in surprise. This wasn't what she'd expected. "They were brilliant," Everett continued, "created a new type of rifle. Faster, more accurate. Could have changed the war." He paused. "Your father destroyed the designs." "Why would he do that?" "Because he saw what his creation could do. At Gettysburg. The prototype." Everett's voice grew distant. "I was there in the field hospital afterward. So many boys torn apart. Your father came to help. One look and he knew. His weapon had done this." Margaret tried to reconcile this image with the gentle father she'd known. "And Daniel, my uncle?" "Daniel wanted the glory, the recognition. When Edwin destroyed the designs, Daniel saw it as betrayal. So he became Silas Redwood out of, what? Spite? Out of a broken heart, maybe. Out of shattered dreams." Everett sighed. "The war broke many things, some men included." Lightning flashed again, followed by another crash of thunder. Rain pounded against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. "If the designs were destroyed," Margaret reasoned, "what does Redwood think I have?" "That," said Everett, "is what we need to find out." He rose, moving to a bookshelf. After a moment's hesitation, he removed a book and extracted a key from behind it. "There's something I need to show you," he said. He led her to a door she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind the staircase. The key turned with a reluctant groan, and the door swung open to reveal a small room unlike any other in the house. Maps covered one wall, dotted with pins and notations. Newspaper clippings were pinned to another. A desk held stacks of papers, letters, by the look of them. And dominating the center of the room was a detailed model of a rifle unlike any Margaret had seen. "For 7 years," Everett said quietly, "I've been tracking Redwood's movements, trying to understand what he's after, what he's become." Margaret approached the rifle model, studying its intricate design. "Is this your father's creation, or my best reconstruction of it from memory?" Everett joined her. "I was there when they tested it, saw what it could do." "Why would my father keep something like this secret from us, from me?" "To protect you." Everett turned to the maps. "Redwood isn't just a common outlaw. He's built something more dangerous. A network. Weapons trafficking, using a modified version of your father's design." Margaret struggled to absorb this information. Her quiet, gentle father, a weapons designer whose creation was now being used for destruction. Her uncle, transformed into a murderous outlaw by betrayal and ambition. "He came for this," she realized, touching the leather pouch around her neck. "The photograph, but what could it possibly—" She broke off, a new thought occurring to her. She pulled out the photograph again, studying it more carefully. The tent behind Edwin and Daniel bore markings, coordinates and dates, and in the background, partially visible, was what looked like a map. "It's not just a photograph," she whispered. "It's a key." Everett looked over her shoulder. "To what?" Margaret traced the faint lines visible in the background. "To wherever they tested the weapon. To whatever my father left behind." Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, wind howling around the eaves of the house like a wounded animal. Inside, Margaret felt something shift, a transformation from hunted to hunter. "Redwood killed my family for this," she said, clutching the photograph. "He killed your wife." She looked up at Everett, her eyes hardening. "I want to know why. And then I want to make him pay." Everett studied her, seeing not just the frightened girl who had collapsed on his land, but a woman forged in fire. Edwin's daughter, without question. "Justice and vengeance look similar in certain lights," he warned, "but they lead to different destinations." "I don't care about the destination," Margaret replied. "I just need to finish the journey." Everett nodded slowly. "Then we'd better get started." As they stood in that room of secrets and a plan began to form between them, a dangerous alliance bound by shared loss and common purpose. Outside, the storm began to subside, the thunder growing more distant, the rain settling into a steady rhythm. But both knew a different kind of storm was gathering, one that had been brewing for years, ever since two brothers made different choices at Gettysburg. A storm that would not pass without blood. Thunder rumbled one final time, like a warning from the heavens. Neither Everett nor Margaret flinched. They had heard more terrifying sounds than nature's fury. They had heard the silence after losing everything. Dawn broke over the Wyoming plains in streaks of amber and gold, casting long shadows across Everett's property. Margaret stood on the porch, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. Sleep had been elusive, her mind churning with revelations about her father, her uncle, and the deadly legacy that had led to her family's murder. Behind her, the screen door creaked as Everett emerged, two steaming cups in hand. Wordlessly, he offered one to Margaret. "I still don't understand," she said after a moment, accepting the coffee. "If my father destroyed the designs, what does Redwood think I have?" Everett leaned against the porch railing, his weathered face thoughtful. "Your father was meticulous, always had contingencies." He sipped his coffee. "He wouldn't destroy something completely without keeping a record somewhere." "But why give me the photograph? Why not just tell me where this record is?" "Maybe he ran out of time," Everett suggested. "Or maybe he wanted to protect you from knowing too much in case—" He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. In case she was caught. In case she was tortured for information. Margaret traced the rim of her cup with a finger. "You knew him well." "I thought I did. Once, well." A shadow crossed Everett's face. "War has a way of revealing men's true characters. Sometimes what's revealed is surprising even to those who think they know you." There was something in his tone, a personal weight to his words that went beyond general observation. Margaret studied him, noting the slight tension in his jaw, the distant look in his eyes. "Edwin wasn't just your comrade," she ventured. "Was he?" Everett set his cup down. "Your father saved my life at Antietam, dragged me out of an artillery barrage when my leg was hit." He rolled up his pant leg to reveal a gnarled scar running from knee to ankle. "By all rights, I should have lost the limb, would have if not for Edwin." "That's why you took me in," Margaret realized. "A debt repaid." "No," Everett's response was firm. "What I owe your father can't be repaid, not through you or anyone." He paused. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Because 7 years ago, I wasn't there when someone else needed help." The unspoken reference to his wife hung between them. "After the war," Everett continued, changing course, "I tried to find normalcy, met Rebecca, built this place." His gaze swept across the modest ranch. "Thought I could outrun the past." "But the past caught up," Everett nodded grimly. "Always does." They finished their coffee in silence, watching as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on thermal currents. "We need to understand what's in that photograph," Everett said finally. "The location, the significance." He turned to her. "And we need allies. This isn't something we can face alone. Who would help us against Redwood's gang? There's a judge in Jackson Hole, Sullivan, served with us during the war. Commanded our regiment before moving west. Everett set his empty cup on the porch railing. If anyone would know about Edwin's work, or what became of Daniel afterward, it would be him. Can he be trusted? Everett's expression was solemn. In war, trust is measured in blood. Sullivan bled with us. That's as good a guarantee as you'll find in this world. Margaret nodded, decision made. When do we leave? Tomorrow. Everett glanced toward the horizon where dust rose from a distant trail. Today we prepare, because I suspect we'll have visitors before nightfall. The day passed in careful preparation. Everett showed Margaret the caches of weapons and supplies he'd maintained over the years, insurance against the return of Redwood's men. They cleaned rifles, counted ammunition, and packed provisions. More importantly, Everett shared what he knew of Redwood's operation, pieced together from 7 years of watchful vigilance. After your father destroyed the designs, Daniel disappeared, he explained as they worked. Military listed him as deserted. Next reports place him in Missouri, running with border raiders, then further west, where he started gathering his own followers. When did he become Silas Redwood? Around 68, near as I can tell. Started small, stagecoach robberies, cattle rustling, but he was smart, unlike most outlaws. Began specializing in weapons. Everett checked the action on a revolver. By 70, he had connections with arms dealers in Mexico and Canada, building an empire on blood and gunpowder. Margaret absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the faint memory she now had of the photograph. The young man standing beside her father, smiling despite the backdrop of war. What turned him from a deserter into this? Everett was quiet for a long moment. Gettysburg changed a lot of men. For your father, it was seeing the carnage his creation could cause. For Daniel, he shook his head. He believed in the weapon, believed it could end the war faster, save lives in the long run. And my father's decision to destroy it? Daniel saw it as betrayal, not just of him, but of every Union soldier still fighting and dying. Everett's voice grew softer. Some betrayals cut deeper than any bullet. As afternoon faded toward evening, they moved their preparations inside. Everett showed Margaret the secret compartments he'd built into the house, places to hide if the worst happened. Rebecca thought I was being paranoid, he said, demonstrating how a section of the pantry floor lifted to reveal a narrow crawl space. Didn't understand why I kept looking over my shoulder after the war. And now? Margaret asked quietly. Everett's expression darkened. Now she's in the ground, and my paranoia is justified. He closed the hidden panel. Better to be called crazy than to be called deceased. Margaret helped prepare a simple dinner, finding strange comfort in the domestic routine after days of terror and revelation. As they ate, she found herself studying Everett more carefully. The methodical way he approached every task, the alert wariness that never fully left his eyes, the deep sadness that seemed permanently etched into the lines of his face. Tell me about her, she said suddenly. Your wife. Surprise flickered across Everett's features, quickly replaced by caution. Why? Because we're hunting the man who took her from you. Because I want to understand what drives you beyond obligation to my father. Everett set down his fork, considering her request. For a moment, Margaret thought he would refuse. Rebecca was a school teacher, he said finally, his voice softening. Met her in Philadelphia after the war. She saw past the uniform, past the nightmares. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Had a laugh that could make flowers grow in winter. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver locket, opening it to reveal a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She believed in second chances, in healing. Convinced me to come west, start fresh. His fingers closed around the locket. Should have left her back east, where it was safe. She wouldn't have stayed, Margaret observed. Not if she loved you. Everett looked up, momentarily startled by her insight. No, he agreed after a moment. She wouldn't have. Margaret hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since seeing Rebecca's grave. When Redwood's men came, did they take something from her too? Something like what they thought I had? A shadow passed over Everett's face. Nothing physical, but Rebecca, she recognized someone. One of Redwood's men, called him by a different name. His knuckles whitened around the locket. That's what sealed her fate. She knew too much. Who did she recognize? Everett's jaw tightened. Redwood himself. She'd seen a photograph in my things, knew him as Daniel Calloway. The revelation hung in the air between them. Rebecca hadn't been a random victim of frontier violence. She had been silenced because she could connect Silas Redwood to his former identity. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. Everett slipped the locket back into his pocket. It was a long time ago. But his eyes told a different story. Some wounds never truly healed, no matter how much time passed. As they cleared the dinner plates, Everett paused, head tilted toward the window. "Riders coming," he said, his posture instantly changing. "At least 3, moving fast." Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. "Redwood's men? Maybe." Everett moved to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Or it could be trouble of a different sort. Either way, we're about to find out." He handed Margaret a revolver. "Remember what we discussed. If things go wrong, use the hideaway in the pantry. Wait until it's clear, then make for Jackson Hole. Find Sullivan." Margaret checked the revolver's chambers, her father's training taking over. "I'm not hiding while you face them alone." "This isn't open for debate." Everett's tone was firm. "I've had my reckoning with death, made my peace with it. You've still got living to do." Before Margaret could argue further, the sound of approaching hooves grew louder. Everett positioned himself by the window, rifle at the ready. "3 riders," he confirmed. "Wait, they're slowing." His brow furrowed. "They're flying a white flag." Margaret joined him at the window, staying to the side as he'd instructed. Through the fading light, she could make out 3 mounted figures approaching the ranch at a deliberate pace. The lead rider held a makeshift white flag, a handkerchief tied to a stick. "Could be a trick," she warned. "Could be," Everett agreed, keeping his rifle raised. "Stay inside." He stepped onto the porch, positioning himself strategically. Margaret remained in the doorway, revolver hidden in the folds of her dress, but ready. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the house. The leader, a tall man with a sheriff's badge glinting on his chest, raised his hand in greeting. "Donovan," he called. "Been a while." Everett's posture relaxed slightly, though his rifle remained at the ready. "Sheriff Taylor, what brings you out this way?" "Got word of trouble headed your direction." The sheriff dismounted, signaling his deputies to remain on horseback. "Clayton Reed was in town yesterday asking questions about a young woman." "Lot of young women pass through these parts," Everett replied neutrally. Sheriff Taylor approached, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "Reed doesn't ask after young women without Redwood's say-so. And when Redwood takes interest in something, blood tends to follow." His gaze shifted to the doorway where Margaret stood. "This the girl?" Everett didn't answer immediately, his silence calculated. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Donovan," the sheriff continued, "just delivering a warning. Redwood's gathered his men at the Crossroads Saloon. 15, maybe 20 guns. They're planning something big." "Why the concern for my welfare, Taylor?" Everett's tone was cautious. "You've made it clear before that my vendetta against Redwood isn't your problem." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. "Because Rebecca was a friend to my wife, because whatever differences you and I have, Redwood is worse." He sighed. "And because I've got word that he's not just after the girl, he knows you're harboring her, says you've got something that belongs to him." Margaret tensed, her hand tightening around the revolver. "When's he coming?" Everett asked. "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." Taylor replaced his hat. "I can't help you officially. Town council's in Redwood's pocket. He's got too many businesses paying taxes. But I thought you should know." He glanced again at Margaret. "Whatever she's carrying, whatever she knows, it might be worth asking if it's worth dying for." Everett's expression remained impassive. "Appreciate the warning." The sheriff nodded, turning back toward his horse. "One more thing. There's a federal agent in town. Arrived yesterday on the evening stage. Been asking about Redwood, too." "What agency?" "Postal Service," he claims. "Name's Harmon. Theodore Harmon." Taylor mounted his horse. "Seems mighty interested in Redwood's operations for a man concerned with mail fraud." With that cryptic information delivered, the sheriff signaled his deputies, and the 3 riders departed as the last light faded from the sky. Everett remained on the porch until the sound of hooves disappeared into the distance. When he finally came inside, his expression was grim. "We need to move," he said, bolting the door. "Tonight. Taylor's a good man, but if he found us, others won't be far behind." Margaret followed him as he moved purposefully through the house, gathering essentials. You trust his information? Taylor has no love for me, but he despises Redwood more. Everett stuffed provisions into saddlebags. And he's right about one thing, this place won't be safe much longer. What about this federal agent, Harmon? Everett paused, considering. Could be legitimate. Redwood's operation crosses state lines, involves the mail system. He shook his head. Or could be another of Redwood's men, wearing a false badge. Either way, it changes nothing. We stick to the plan. Jackson Hole, Judge Sullivan. As they prepared for departure, Margaret felt a strange reluctance. In just 2 days, Everett's ranch had become something of a sanctuary, the first place she'd felt anything approaching safety since Lancaster. I'm sorry, she said quietly as Everett doused the lamps, for bringing this to your door. In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, only his silhouette as he moved toward her. Redwood and I were always destined for a reckoning, he replied, his voice low. You just hastened the inevitable. They slipped out the back of the house under the cover of darkness. Everett had prepared the horses earlier, anticipating the need for a swift departure. As they mounted, Margaret cast one last glance at the ranch house, at the life Everett had built and was now abandoning because of her. We'll ride through the night, Everett said, checking his saddlebags one final time. Stay off the main trails. Should reach Jackson Hole by mid-morning if we push hard. Margaret nodded, adjusting her borrowed hat. The photograph hung heavy around her neck, its secrets still largely undeciphered. Whatever her father had hidden within its seemingly innocuous image, it had cost her family their lives. Now it might cost Everett his home as well. As they rode away from the ranch, the moon emerged from behind a cloud, casting silver light across the prairie. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the desolation in Margaret's heart. Your father once told me, Everett said suddenly, breaking the silence, that the measure of a life isn't found in its beginning or its end, but in the choices made between them. Margaret glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected reminiscence. He made his choice at Gettysburg, Everett continued. Daniel made his. I made mine. He looked at her, his expression solemn in the moonlight. Now you're making yours. I didn't choose this, Margaret protested. No, but you're choosing how to face it. Everett urged his horse forward. That's all any of us can do. They rode in silence after that, the rhythm of hooves against earth providing a steady counterpoint to Margaret's turbulent thoughts. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. Hours passed. The landscape changed gradually as they left the open prairie for more wooded terrain. Everett led them through narrow passages and shallow streams, clearly following a route designed to confuse any potential pursuers. As dawn approached, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and drink from Everett's canteen. Margaret's muscles ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she made no complaint. Not much further, Everett said, scanning the lightning horizon. Sullivan's place is just outside town. We'll go there directly, avoid being seen in Jackson Hole itself. Margaret nodded, too exhausted for conversation. The events of the past week had caught up with her. The loss of her family, the desperate flight, the revelations about her father and uncle. She swayed slightly in the saddle. Everett noticed. Hold on, he encouraged. Just a little longer. They resumed their journey as the first rays of sunlight pierced the eastern sky. The terrain grew more mountainous, with pine forests replacing the open grasslands. The air carried the scent of resin and wildflowers. There, Everett said finally, pointing to a plume of smoke rising above the trees ahead. Sullivan's place. They approached cautiously, Everett leading them on a circuitous route that afforded views of the property from multiple angles. The house was larger than Everett's ranch, with a stately 2-story main building and several outbuildings arranged in a neat compound. A sign at the entrance read Sullivan's Bench in carefully carved letters. Looks quiet, Everett observed. No extra horses in the corral. Good sign. They rode up the main path, both alert despite their fatigue. As they neared the house, the front door opened, and a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard emerged onto the porch. Well, I'll be damned, the man said, leaning on an ornate cane. Everett Donovan, thought you'd turned hermit for good. Everett dismounted, approaching the porch with caution that didn't quite mask his respect. Judge Sullivan, it's been a while. 7 years, 3 months, and approximately 18 days, Sullivan replied, his keen eyes shifting to Margaret. But who's counting? He straightened, a military bearing evident despite his reliance on the cane. And who might this young lady be? Margaret Calloway, Everett answered, Edwin's daughter. Sullivan went perfectly still, only his eyes moving as he reassessed Margaret with this new information. Edwin's girl, he repeated softly. Last I heard, he'd settled near Lancaster with a family. His gaze sharpened. Why isn't he with you? Because he's dead, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the pain the words still caused. Killed by Silas Redwood. Sullivan's expression darkened. He glanced around the property before gesturing them inside. This conversation is best continued indoors. The interior of Sullivan's home reflected its owner's military background and judicial career. Maps and legal books lined the walls. Certificates and commendations hung in neat frames. A pair of cavalry sabers crossed above the fireplace. Sit, Sullivan directed, indicating a large table in what appeared to be his study. You look half dead from the trail. As they settled, a housekeeper appeared with coffee and bread. Sullivan waved her away after she'd served them, closing the door firmly behind her. Now, he said, taking his own seat at the head of the table, tell me everything. For the next hour, Margaret and Everett related the events that had brought them to Sullivan's door. The attack on Lancaster, Margaret's flight, their discovery of the connection between Edwin Calloway and Silas Redwood, and the mysterious photograph that seemed to be at the center of it all. Sullivan listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing little. When they finished, he rose and moved to a cabinet, extracting a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. Edwin Calloway, he said as he poured, was one of the finest officers I ever commanded, and I was the one who authorized their weapons project. His eyes met Everett's. I've carried that decision with me ever since. Sullivan returned to his seat, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. What Everett may not have told you is that the prototype was actually deployed at Gettysburg under my orders, a select unit on the second day. His eyes grew distant. We'd never seen such devastation from infantry weapons. The carnage was... He shook his head, unable to find adequate words. When your father came to my tent afterward, his uniform was still stained with blood from the field hospital. He didn't rage or accuse. He simply said, "This ends now, James." And by morning, the plans were ashes. Sullivan's voice softened. That decision cost him everything. His military career, his relationship with Daniel, even eventually, his life. Margaret absorbed this new information. The weight of her father's choice seemed to fill the room. Margaret withdrew the photograph from its pouch, setting it carefully on the table. This is what Redwood is after. My father gave it to me before he died. Sullivan studied the image, recognition lighting his eyes. I took this photograph myself, he said softly. July 1863, just before Gettysburg. He turned it over, reading the inscription on the back. 2 brothers, 1 choice. His finger traced the faded writing. Edwin's handwriting. What does it mean? Margaret pressed. Why would Redwood kill for this? Sullivan examined the photograph more carefully, holding it up to the light. The tent markings, he murmured. Field designations, coordinates. He looked up, and in the background, part of a map, a location. Where? Everett asked. Western Pennsylvania, near where they tested the prototype. Sullivan set the photograph down. There was a hidden workshop there. Only a few of us knew about it. My father must have left something there, Margaret realized. Something Redwood wants badly enough to kill for. The complete designs, perhaps, Sullivan suggested, or something else entirely. He drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. Edwin was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else, always planning for contingencies. Could he have created something new? Everett asked. After the war? Sullivan considered this. Possible. Edwin never stopped inventing. But after Gettysburg, his focus shifted. He looked at Margaret. Did your father ever mention medical research? Treatments for pain or infection? Margaret blinked in surprise. He was always experimenting with herbal remedies. Said it was a hobby from his time in the army. Not just a hobby, Sullivan said. After seeing the carnage at Gettysburg, Edwin became obsessed with finding ways to save lives rather than take them. Studied with Everett here for a time. Margaret turned to Everett, who nodded confirmation. Your father had a gift for chemistry, Everett explained. Started developing treatments for surgical shock, infection, had ideas decades ahead of his time. This new revelation left Margaret reeling. Her quiet, gentle father, first a weapons designer, then a medical researcher, had been so much more than the mining engineer she'd known. So Redwood might not be after weapon designs, she said slowly. He could be after medical formulas, which could be worth a fortune to the right buyers, Sullivan noted, especially if they're as revolutionary as Edwin's other work. The three sat in silence, absorbing the implications of this theory. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting patterns of light across the study floor through the leaded windows. There's something else you should know, Sullivan said finally, his tone grave. A federal agent arrived in Jackson Hole 2 days ago. Theodore Harmon, from the Postal Service, supposedly investigating mail fraud connected to Redwood's operations. Everett nodded. Sheriff Taylor mentioned him. I don't trust him, Sullivan stated flatly. His credentials appear legitimate, but something feels wrong. He knows too much about Redwood's operation for someone supposedly new to the case. You think he's one of Redwood's men? Margaret asked. Or someone with an agenda of his own? Sullivan leaned forward. The point is, we can't be certain who to trust beyond this room. What do you suggest? Everett asked. Sullivan rose, moving to a large map mounted on the wall. We decipher the exact location from the photograph. Send a small party to investigate, just the three of us. Find whatever Edwin left behind before Redwood does. And then? Margaret questioned. Sullivan turned, his expression solemn. Then we decide whether it's something that should be found at all. He looked pointedly at Everett. Your father made that choice once before, Miss Calloway. We may need to honor it again. Before Margaret could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention, horses approaching at speed. Sullivan moved to the window, his posture tensing. 4 riders, he reported, coming fast. He turned, his expression grim. One of them is Theodore Harmon. Everett was on his feet immediately, checking his revolver. Coincidence? I don't believe in those anymore, Sullivan replied, retrieving a shotgun from a cabinet. Miss Calloway, there's a hidden passage behind the bookshelf. Servants' stairs from the old days. Margaret stood, clutching the photograph. I'm not hiding. This isn't about bravery, Sullivan said sharply. It's about protecting what your father died for. The sound of hooves grew louder, then stopped. Male voices called out, requesting entry. Go, Everett urged Margaret. If things go wrong, follow the passage. It leads to the stables. Take a horse and ride for the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne. Ask for Marshal Bishop. Margaret hesitated, torn between the desire to stand her ground and the knowledge that the photograph's secrets needed to be protected. Your father made his choice, Everett said quietly. Now make yours. After a moment's internal struggle, Margaret nodded. Sullivan moved quickly to the bookshelf, triggering a hidden mechanism that caused it to swing outward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. We'll find you when it's safe, Sullivan promised, as she stepped into the darkness. The bookshelf closed behind her with a soft click, plunging Margaret into near total darkness. Only thin slivers of light penetrated through the cracks in the wall. She pressed her ear against the panel, straining to hear. Muffled voices came from the study, Sullivan's cultured tones, Everett's deeper rumble, and another voice, smooth and authoritative. The newcomer, Harmon, presumably, was asking questions. About Redwood, about Lancaster, about a young woman seen traveling with Everett. Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she feared it might be heard through the wall. Carefully, she began to feel her way along the passage, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. The passage sloped downward, the air growing cooler and damper as she descended. After what seemed an eternity of cautious progress, Margaret felt the passage widen. Her outstretched hands encountered what felt like a wooden door. She fumbled in the darkness, eventually locating a latch. The door opened into the back of a stable, just as Sullivan had promised. Daylight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, providing enough illumination for Margaret to see several horses in their stalls. She moved quietly, selecting a sturdy-looking bay mare. As she prepared to saddle the animal, a noise at the stable's main entrance froze her in place. Heavy footsteps approached. A man's voice, unfamiliar, muttered something indistinct. Margaret pressed herself into the shadows of the stall, one hand reaching for the revolver Everett had given her. The stable door creaked open. A shaft of sunlight illuminated the dusty interior. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. I know you're in here, Miss Calloway, The man called, his voice cultured and calm. No need for alarm. Judge Sullivan sent me to find you. Margaret remained silent, unconvinced. My name is Theodore Harmon, the man continued, stepping further into the stable. Federal agent, I understand your reluctance to trust me, but we have a common enemy in Silas Redwood. As her eyes adjusted to the interplay of light and shadow, Margaret could make out more details of the man. He wore a well-tailored suit despite the frontier setting. A badge glinted on his lapel. His face was handsome in a severe way, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing eyes. Most noticeably, he wore a ring on his right hand, a distinctive signet ring with a design Margaret recognized instantly. Her father had worn its twin. Where are Everett and Judge Sullivan? She demanded, still concealed in the shadows. Speaking with my colleagues, Harmon replied. I offered to check the grounds, ensure no one else was lurking about. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect. They told me what happened in Lancaster. You have my deepest condolences for your loss. Margaret remained silent, assessing her options. The photograph felt heavy around her neck, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Your father was a great man, Harmon continued. His work during the war saved countless lives. This caught Margaret off guard. You knew my father? Harmon nodded. Not personally, but his reputation in certain circles was legendary. He gestured toward the stable door. Please, Miss Calloway, Judge Sullivan is expecting us back. We have much to discuss regarding Redwood. Something in his manner, a certain calculation behind the courtesy, made Margaret hesitate. Show me your credentials, she demanded. Without protest, Harmon produced a leather wallet, opening it to display an official-looking document bearing the seal of the United States Postal Service. An unusual agency to be investigating murder, Margaret observed, still not moving from her hiding place. Redwood's operation uses the mail to coordinate weapons shipments, Harmon explained smoothly. It's a federal offense, a way for us to build a case against him when local authorities are reluctant. His explanation made sense, yet Margaret couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts. Right now, they were screaming caution. I'll follow, she said finally. Keep your distance. Harmon smiled thinly. As you wish. He replaced his hat and stepped outside. Margaret emerged cautiously from the shadows, revolver still in hand. Through the stable door, she could see that Sullivan's house in the distance. No signs of conflict or danger. Perhaps her suspicions were unfounded. Still, she maintained her distance from Harmon as they walked back toward the main house. Something about him, his too perfect appearance, his convenient arrival, the familiar ring, kept her wary. May I ask, Harmon said without turning, what exactly Redwood is after? Sullivan was circumspect on that point. I'm sure he had his reasons, Margaret replied noncommittally. Indeed, Harmon's tone remained pleasant, but cooperation would help us build our case against Redwood more efficiently. They had reached the house now. Harmon opened the door, gesturing for Margaret to enter first. She hesitated, then stepped inside, revolver still concealed in the folds of her dress. The main hall was empty. No sounds came from the direction of Sullivan's study. This way, Harmon directed, indicating a door different from the one leading to the study where she'd left Everett and Sullivan. Margaret stopped. Where are they? The judge thought it more comfortable to continue our discussion in the drawing room, Harmon explained. More seating for all of us. His explanation was reasonable, yet the prickling sensation at the back of Margaret's neck intensified. She gripped the revolver tighter. After you, she insisted. A flicker of annoyance crossed Harmon's face, quickly masked. As you wish. He opened the door, revealing a well-appointed drawing room beyond. Inside, Everett and Sullivan sat in armchairs, apparently at ease. Two other men, presumably Harmon's colleagues, stood by the windows. All eyes turned to Margaret as she entered. There you are, Sullivan said, rising to greet her. Agent Harmon found you, I see. Margaret nodded, still cautious. She studied Everett's face, searching for any sign of coercion or danger. He met her gaze steadily, giving a slight nod of reassurance. We've been discussing Redwood's operation, Sullivan continued. Agent Harmon has been tracking his activities for some time. Seems our interests align. Indeed they do, Harmon agreed, closing the door behind him. The soft click of the latch echoed in the suddenly silent room. Margaret moved to stand near Everett, drawing comfort from his solid presence. And what exactly are those interests, Agent Harmon? Harmon smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. Justice, Miss Calloway, for your family, for Mrs. Donovan, for all of Redwood's victims. Admirable, Margaret acknowledged, but specific to this case, what are you after? The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Harmon exchanged glances with his colleagues. Sullivan cleared his throat. Agent Harmon believes, the judge explained carefully, that your father's research could be valuable to the government, particularly his medical work. Margaret's suspicions deepened. How would he know about that? We only just discovered it ourselves. A heavy silence filled the room. Harmon's smile faded. Because, Miss Calloway, he said finally, your father wasn't working alone. He removed his gloves, revealing the signet ring in its entirety, not merely similar to her father's, but identical. Edwin Calloway was developing medicines for the United States Army Medical Corps, Harmon continued, under a classified program that began after the war. Margaret looked to Everett for confirmation. His expression was guarded. Is this true? She asked him. Everett's jaw tightened. Possible. Your father and I corresponded about medical matters after the war. He never mentioned government involvement, but he was always discreet. The work was need to know, Harmon added. Even Dr. Donovan wouldn't have been informed of the official nature of the research. Margaret absorbed this new information, struggling to reconcile it with everything else she'd learned about her father. And Redwood, how does he fit into this? We believe he learned of your father's research, Harmon explained, recognized its potential value. The medical formulas Edwin was developing could revolutionize battlefield medicine or be weaponized in the wrong hands. It made a terrible kind of sense. Yet Margaret couldn't shake her unease. Something felt wrong about Harmon, about this entire situation. She fingered the photograph through her dress, its presence a constant reminder of her father's final message. Whatever secrets it contained, Edwin had entrusted them to her, not to some government agent she'd never met. The photograph, she said slowly, you believe it leads to my father's research. We believe it contains coordinates to his hidden laboratory, yes, Harmon confirmed. Margaret noticed he hadn't asked to see it, hadn't demanded she hand it over. Either he was being respectful of her loss, or he already knew exactly what it contained. And you want me to help you find it, she concluded. Your father's work belongs with those who will use it responsibly, Harmon said, not with criminals like Redwood. Margaret looked to Sullivan and Everett, searching their faces for guidance. The judge appeared convinced by Harmon's explanation. Everett's expression remained unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Outside, the sun had reached its zenith. Light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the distance, a church bell tolled noon, a reminder that beyond these walls, normal life continued, untouched by hidden laboratories and government secrets. Margaret thought of Lancaster, of her mother's garden, of her little brother's laugh, of her father's gentle hands showing her how to aim a rifle, hands that had apparently designed weapons of war and medicines of mercy with equal skill. I need time to think, she said finally. Harmon nodded, though disappointment flashed briefly in his eyes. Of course, this is a lot to process. He glanced at his colleagues. We'll return to town for now. But Miss Calloway, his voice hardened slightly, Redwood is closing in. We don't have the luxury of time. With that warning delivered, Harmon and his men took their leave. The sound of their horses galloping away broke the tense silence that had fallen over the drawing room. As soon as they were gone, Everett moved to the window, watching until the riders disappeared from view. I don't trust him, he said flatly. Sullivan sighed, lowering himself into a chair. His leg, injured at Gettysburg, Margaret had learned, seemed to be bothering him. His credentials are legitimate. I have verified them myself. Papers can be forged, Everett countered. And that story about Edwin working for the Army, did you know about that? Sullivan shook his head. No, but it's plausible. Edwin had connections in Washington after the war. Convenient timing, though, Everett noted. Harmon showing up just as we're deciphering the photograph. That ring troubles me, Sullivan said, rubbing his injured leg thoughtfully. I saw similar ones during the later war years. A small circle of doctors and scientists working outside military channels. They called themselves the Healers. Edwin mentioned them once. A secret medical society? Margaret asked. More than that, Everett interjected. Your father corresponded with several physicians after the war who used a distinctive seal on their letters, a staff of Asclepius surrounded by herbs. I never made the connection until seeing Harmon's ring. Sullivan nodded grimly. If Harmon is part of that circle, he might have his own photograph or clue from Edwin. Your father was careful about spreading knowledge, never putting all pieces in one place. Margaret removed the photograph from its pouch, studying it with new eyes. My father gave this to me with his dying breath. Told me never to give in to anyone. She looked up. Not the army, not his friends, no one. Sullivan stroked his beard thoughtfully. Edwin always had his reasons. Question is, what were they in this case? The three fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, clouds began to gather on the horizon, the promise of an afternoon storm. Inside, the tension was palpable, a storm of a different kind brewing. Margaret traced the faint outlines visible in the photograph's background. A map, coordinates, a location that might hold answers, or more questions. We need to find this place, she said firmly, before Redwood does, before Harmon does. She looked at Everett and Sullivan. We need to know what my father was protecting, what he died for. Everett nodded, decision made. We'll leave at nightfall, fewer eyes watching. I'll come with you, Sullivan said, rising with effort. I know those Pennsylvania hills, and I owe it to Edwin. As they began making preparations, Margaret found herself drawn to the window. The storm clouds were gathering faster now, dark and ominous on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the journey ahead. Whatever her father had hidden, weapon designs, medical formulas, or something else entirely, she would find it. And then she would decide, as Edwin had at Gettysburg, whether some creations were too dangerous to exist in a world of men like Silas Redwood, or men like Theodore Harmon. The storm on the horizon rumbled with distant thunder. Margaret watched it approach, feeling a strange calm despite the dangers that lay ahead. For the first time since Lancaster, she had purpose beyond survival, beyond vengeance even. She had her father's legacy to protect, and she would not fail him. The storm broke over Jackson Hole as dusk settled across the valley. Rain pounded against the windows of Sullivan's study, where Margaret, Everett, and the judge finalized their preparations. A map lay spread across the large oak table, illuminated by the warm glow of oil lamps. I've matched the coordinates from the photograph, Sullivan said, his finger tracing a path across the Pennsylvania map. It's here, near Bedford, remote area, wooded hills, perfect place to hide a laboratory. Everett studied the location, his expression thoughtful. 3 days by rail if we push hard. We'll take the eastbound train tonight, Sullivan decided. Less chance of being observed leaving town. He glanced at the window where lightning split the darkening sky. The storm will provide good cover. Margaret examined the weapons Sullivan had laid out. Revolvers, rifles, ammunition. The preparations for war rather than scientific discovery. Do you really think we'll need all this? Redwood won't be the only one looking for your father's work, Everett replied. Harmon concerns me even more. Because he's government? Margaret asked. Because we don't know who he really is, Everett corrected. Government men are predictable. They follow rules, procedures. Harmon operates too independently. Sullivan nodded agreement. And that ring, identical to your father's. Military officers don't wear matching jewelry unless it means something. Thunder crashed outside, rattling the windows. In the brief silence that followed, Margaret fingered the photograph, studying the two brothers standing side by side, united before choices tore them apart. What do you think they were working on? After the war, I mean. Sullivan and Everett exchanged glances. Your father became obsessed with pain management after Gettysburg, Everett said slowly. He saw too many men suffer during amputations, infections. Morphine was scarce, often impure. He mentioned research into native plant compounds, Sullivan added, something he'd learned from an Army scout with Indian knowledge. A medicine, then, Margaret concluded, something to ease suffering. Or something more, Everett said darkly. Medicines can become weapons in the wrong hands, especially new compounds with unknown properties. The implications hung heavy in the air. Whatever Edwin Calloway had created, multiple parties were willing to kill for it. That alone suggested its power extended beyond simple pain relief. We should move, Sullivan said. checking his pocket watch. Train leaves in 90 minutes. They gathered their supplies, moving with the efficiency of people accustomed to urgency. Sullivan had arranged for horses to be waiting behind the stables, a precaution against watching eyes. As Margaret secured her saddlebags, Everett approached, offering a small leather holster. "Keep this accessible," he said, indicating the revolver she'd been carrying. "Not just for Redwood's men, for anyone who tries to stop us." Margaret accepted the holster, noting the seriousness in his expression. "You really don't trust Harmon." "I've seen too many men with official papers and unofficial intentions." Everett adjusted his own weapon. "Government sanction doesn't mean righteous." They slipped out through the servants' entrance, the rain providing a curtain of privacy as they hurried to the waiting horses. The animals shifted nervously, displeased with the weather. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving through the darkness, leaving Sullivan's estate behind. The journey to the train station followed back roads and cattle paths, avoiding the main thoroughfare through Jackson Hole. Lightning periodically illuminated their way, the accompanying thunder masking the sound of their horses' hooves. "There's the station," Sullivan murmured as they approached the outskirts of town. "No signs of Redwood's men." "Or Harmon's," Everett added, scanning the area with practiced eyes. They dismounted at a distance from the station, concealing their horses in a small grove of trees. Sullivan had arranged for a stable boy to retrieve them later. One more precaution against discovery. The train sat waiting on the tracks, steam billowing from its engine into the rain-soaked night. Few passengers milled about the platform, most seeking shelter from the downpour inside the station house. "Stay close," Everett instructed as they made their way through the mud toward the station. "Keep your head down." And inside the small building, several travelers huddled on benches, their faces illuminated by a single hanging lamp. Sullivan moved to the ticket counter, while Everett and Margaret positioned themselves in a shadowy corner, backs to the wall, watching the entrance. "Private compartment," Sullivan said when he returned, passing them tickets. "Rear car, we board last." The minutes dragged as they waited for the boarding call. Each new arrival through the station door brought a moment of tension, but neither Redwood's men nor Harmon appeared. Finally, the station master announced the eastbound train's imminent departure. The small group of passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward the platform. "Wait," Everett said, placing a restraining hand on Margaret's arm. "Let the others go ahead." They watched as the other travelers boarded, Sullivan maintaining a casual conversation about cattle prices to deflect attention. When the platform was nearly empty, they finally moved toward the train. Just as they reached the steps to the rear car, Margaret's gaze caught on a figure at the far end of the platform, a man standing in the shadows, watching. Though distance and darkness obscured his features, she recognized the distinctive wide-brimmed hat. "Clayton Reed," she whispered, tugging Everett's sleeve. "By the water tower." Everett didn't turn but subtly shifted his posture, one hand moving closer to his concealed weapon. "Get on board," he murmured. "Now." Sullivan went first, then Margaret, with Everett covering their retreat. As the train whistle blew its final warning, Everett climbed aboard, pulling the door shut behind him. Through the window, Margaret saw Reed step forward into the light, making no attempt to board or interfere. Merely watching, a cold smile playing at his lips. "He's not trying to stop us," she said as the train lurched into motion. "Why no?" "Because he already knows where we're going," Sullivan replied grimly. The realization settled like ice in Margaret's stomach. Harmon told them. "Or they told Harmon," Everett suggested, leading them through the narrow corridor toward their private compartment. Either way, they're one step ahead. Their compartment was small but comfortable, with padded bench seats and a small table between them. Sullivan secured the door while Everett checked the window locks and drew the curtains. "We need to assume Redwood has men on this train," Sullivan said, removing his rain-soaked coat, "and possibly on the route ahead." "And Harmon," Margaret added. "Likely pursuing independently," Everett said, his expression troubled. "Which means we're caught between two forces, neither friendly." The train gathered speed, its rhythmic clacking a counterpoint to the storm still raging outside. Margaret sank onto one of the benches, sudden exhaustion washing over her. The events of the past week, her family's murder, her flight, the revelations about her father, all crashed down at once. Everett noticed. "You should rest," he said, his tone gentler than usual. "We have a long journey ahead." Sullivan nodded agreement. I'll take first watch. You two get some sleep. Margaret wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't tired, but her body betrayed her with a deep yawn. She hadn't truly slept since leaving Everett's ranch. Wake me in a few hours, she insisted, settling into the corner of the bench. I'll take a turn. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Everett's watchful gaze on the door, his hand never far from his weapon. Margaret awoke to sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. She blinked, momentarily disoriented. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear blue sky visible through the window. The train continued its steady progress eastward, now passing through open plains dotted with small settlements. Across from her, Sullivan dozed, his cane propped against the seat beside him. Everett sat alert by the door, a book open in his lap, though his attention seemed focused on the corridor beyond. You let me sleep through the night, Margaret accused, straightening up. Everett glanced at her, a hint of amusement softening his features. You needed it more than we did. Any trouble? She asked, noting the untouched weapons. None, which concerns me. Everett closed his book. A medical text, Margaret noted. Too quiet. Sullivan stirred, military training bringing him to alertness instantly. Morning already, he observed, checking his pocket watch. We're making good time. A knock at the compartment door silenced further conversation. Everett motioned for Margaret to move away from the door as he rose, one hand sliding inside his coat. Breakfast service, called a voice from the corridor. Coffee and pastries. Everett exchanged glances with Sullivan, who nodded. Cautiously, Everett opened the door to reveal a uniformed porter with a serving tray. Coffee, sir, the porter offered. Compliments of a gentleman in the forward car. Said he recognized the judge. Margaret tensed. Sullivan frowned, leaning forward. Which gentleman? Didn't give a name, sir. Well-dressed fellow. Had a fancy ring. The porter shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. Said you were old war comrades. Everett took the tray but blocked the porter from entering. Thank you. That will be all. After the porter departed, Everett set the tray on the small table, examining its contents with suspicion. Harmon, he concluded. Letting us know he's watching, Sullivan agreed. Clever. Margaret stared at the steaming coffee cups. Could it be poisoned? Unlikely, Sullivan said. Too obvious, but we'll avoid it nonetheless. Everett opened the window slightly, dumping the coffee outside. The pastries followed. We'll purchase our own breakfast at the next stop, he decided. The incident cast a pall over the morning. Harmon's presence on the train confirmed their suspicions that they were being tracked. The question remained, was he following them to help or hinder? As the day progressed, they took turns watching the corridor while reviewing their plans. The coordinates from the photograph pointed to a location several miles from the Bedford train station. They would need to secure horses, supplies, and possibly additional weapons upon arrival. Assuming Redwood doesn't have men waiting at every step, Margaret noted. Or Harmon, Everett added. Sullivan studied the map again. There's a small town here, about 5 miles from our destination. Less conspicuous than Bedford. We could disembark there, acquire what we need. Everett nodded approval. Good thinking. Fewer eyes. As they discussed logistics, Margaret found her thoughts drifting to her father. The man in her memories, gentle, thoughtful, always ready with a story or lesson, seemed increasingly at odds with the figure emerging from Sullivan and Everett's recollections. A weapons designer turned medical researcher, a man with government connections and dangerous secrets. What was he really like, she asked suddenly, interrupting their planning. During the war, I mean. The men looked up, surprised by the question. Your father, Sullivan said after a moment, was the rare sort of officer who earned respect rather than demanded it. Men would follow him anywhere. Brilliant, as I've said, Everett added, but more importantly, he had conscience, saw the humanity in every situation, even at its worst. He could have had a distinguished military career after the war, Sullivan continued, was offered promotions, positions in Washington, turned them all down to pursue his research independently. Why, Margaret pressed? If he wanted to help people with his medical work, wouldn't government resources have been useful? Everett and Sullivan exchanged glances. Your father became disillusioned with authority after Gettysburg, Everett said carefully. Saw how commanders made decisions from comfortable distances while men died in mud and blood. He believed some discoveries were too important to be controlled by generals and politicians, Sullivan added. said certain knowledge belonged to humanity, not governments. Margaret absorbed this, feeling both pride and sorrow. Pride in her father's principles, sorrow that she'd never truly known this side of him. And Daniel, she asked, what made him so different? Sullivan's expression darkened. Ambition, brilliance without the tempering influence of compassion. He sighed, the younger brother always trying to escape the elder's shadow. They loved each other once, Everett said quietly. That's what made the break so devastating. Not just colleagues or comrades, brothers. The conversation lapsed into silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the train continued its eastward journey. Outside the window, the landscape gradually transformed from open plains to rolling hills as they approached the Mississippi River. Noon came and went. They purchased a simple lunch from a vendor during a brief stop, eating quickly before returning to the safety of their compartment. No further gifts arrived from Harmon, though Margaret frequently sensed they were being watched. As afternoon faded toward evening, the train began slowing for another scheduled stop. Sullivan consulted his timetable. St. Louis, he announced, 30-minute delay while they switch engines. We should stretch our legs, but stay together. The St. Louis station bustled with activity, passengers disembarking and boarding, porters wheeling luggage, vendors hawking newspapers and refreshments. After the confinement of the compartment, the open air felt refreshing despite the lingering summer heat. Keep your eyes open, Everett murmured as they moved through the crowd. Redwood's men could be anywhere. They maintained casual expressions while remaining vigilant, purchasing coffee and sandwiches from a platform vendor. As Sullivan paid, Margaret noticed a familiar figure across the platform. Theodore Harmon engaged in conversation with a station official. He made no attempt to hide his presence, even nodding slightly when he caught Margaret's eye. Our shadow isn't bothering with subtlety anymore, she observed quietly. Sullivan followed her gaze. He wants us to know he's here. Question is, why? Psychological warfare, Everett suggested, keeping us off balance, wondering about his intentions. They retreated to a quieter section of the platform to finish their refreshments. Margaret watched Harmon conclude his conversation and board the train several cars ahead of theirs. What if we confronted him directly? She proposed, demanded to know his true intentions. Too risky, Everett countered. If he's hostile, we'd be playing into his hands. And if he's genuinely trying to help, Margaret pressed, then he can prove it by staying out of our way, Sullivan concluded, gathering their things as the boarding call sounded. For now, we stick to our plan. They returned to their compartment as the train prepared to depart. The brief stop had done little to ease the tension that had been building throughout the day. If anything, Harmon's visible presence had heightened it. As the train pulled away from St. Louis, Everett closed the curtains against the gathering darkness outside. Sullivan spread their map across the small table, reviewing their route one more time. Another day to reach Pennsylvania, he estimated, assuming no delays. Margaret touched the photograph in her pocket, the key to whatever awaited them at their destination. Do you think my father left instructions? Some explanation of what he was working on? Edwin was thorough, Everett replied. If he hid his research, he would have left guidance for whoever found it. Meant for you, most likely, Sullivan added. The photograph wasn't random. He entrusted it to you specifically. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Her father had prepared for his own death, had foreseen the danger and still chosen to protect his work rather than destroy it. What could be so valuable or so dangerous? Night fell completely as the train continued eastward. They established a watch rotation, allowing two to rest while the third remained alert. Despite the precautions, an uneasy feeling settled over Margaret as she tried to sleep during her off-watch hours. The steady rhythm of the train's wheels against the tracks eventually lulled her into a fitful slumber. Her dreams were fragmented. Images of Lancaster burning, her father pressing the photograph into her hand, Daniel/Silas Redwood watching from the shadows, his face shifting between youth and hardened criminal. She awoke with a start as the train whistle sounded, announcing another stop. The compartment was dimly lit by a single lamp. Sullivan dozed in the corner while Everett kept watch by the door. Where are we? Margaret asked, disoriented. Indianapolis, Everett replied. Brief stop for water and coal. He checked his pocket watch. Just past midnight. Margaret rose, stretching limbs stiff from the confined space. Any sign of our shadows? Nothing obvious. Too quiet, like before. Everett's expression was troubled. I don't like it. The train lurched slightly as it began moving again. Sullivan stirred, military instincts bringing him instantly alert. My watch, he said, checking the time. You two should rest. Everett nodded, moving to the bench opposite Margaret. She watched as he settled himself, noting how he positioned his body, back to the wall, clear view of the door, hand near his weapon even in repose. Always the soldier, never truly at ease. You don't have to do this, you know, she said softly. This isn't your fight. Everett's gaze met hers in the dim lamplight. It became my fight 7 years ago, when Redwood killed Rebecca. But risking your life for my father's research, your father saved more than my leg at Antietam, Everett interrupted. He reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. Not just to patch up soldiers so they could return to killing, but to ease suffering. His expression softened slightly. If Edwin created something that could do that, it's worth protecting. Worth dying for, if necessary. Margaret was struck by the quiet conviction in his voice. Beneath the hardened exterior shaped by war and loss, Everett Donovan still believed in something greater than vengeance. Get some sleep, Sullivan advised from his position by the door. Dawn's not far off, and tomorrow brings us closer to answers. He paused. Or more questions. Margaret settled back into her corner, but sleep proved elusive. Instead, she found herself watching Everett as he drifted off, his features relaxing slightly in slumber. In repose, the lines of hardship and loss were less pronounced. She could glimpse the man he might have been in a kinder world, the dedicated doctor Rebecca had fallen in love with. Outside, America rolled by in darkness, farms and small towns, rivers and forests, all cloaked in night's anonymity. Somewhere ahead lay Bedford, Pennsylvania, and the secret her father had deemed worth dying for. Somewhere aboard this very train, Theodore Harmon watched and waited for his moment. And somewhere behind, Silas Redwood's men followed, determined to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Dawn found them crossing into Ohio, the landscape increasingly industrial as they passed through manufacturing towns, awakening to another day of labor. Sullivan purchased newspapers at a brief stop, scanning for any information about Redwood or unusual federal activities. Nothing relevant, he reported, folding the papers aside, though there's mention of increased military presence around Pittsburgh. Railway security, officially. Ooh, convenient timing, Everett observed. Harmon's influence, perhaps? Or someone else entirely, Sullivan suggested. Edwin had connections beyond Harmon, whatever he represents. The day passed in tense monotony. They rotated positions, ate sparingly from provisions purchased at stops, and maintained constant vigilance. No further signs of Harmon appeared, though the sensation of being watched never fully dissipated. By late afternoon, they were deep in Pennsylvania territory, the terrain growing increasingly mountainous. Sullivan estimated their arrival in Bedford by early evening, ahead of schedule thanks to favorable rail conditions. We'll need to move quickly once we arrive, he advised. Find transportation to Everett's Creek. Secure supplies. Everett's Creek? Margaret questioned. Sullivan indicated a small mark on the map. Tiny settlement about 5 miles from our destination, named after a Union officer who camped there during the war, no relation to our Everett. Small enough to avoid notice, Everett added, large enough to have what we need. As they gathered their belongings in preparation for arrival, a sudden commotion erupted further up the train, shouting voices, the sound of running feet in the corridor outside. Everett was instantly alert, drawing his revolver. Stay back, he ordered, positioning himself between Margaret and the door. Sullivan moved to the window, peering out. Train slowing, he reported, not near a station. The door to their compartment burst open. A train conductor stood there, face pale. Federal agents boarding, he gasped, checking all passengers. Something about fugitives. Everett exchanged alarmed glances with Sullivan. Harmon, he concluded. We need to leave, now, Sullivan decided, gathering his coat and cane. Train's still moving, the conductor protested. Not for long, Sullivan replied grimly. He turned to Margaret and Everett. Ready? Margaret secured the photograph inside her bodice, then checked her revolver. Ready. They followed the conductor's protest down the corridor toward the rear of the train, which was indeed slowing rapidly. Through the windows, Margaret glimpsed men in uniform moving alongside the tracks. Not regular army, but some other kind of government force. There, Sullivan indicated the rear platform. We jumped before they finished boarding the front. The train had slowed to a crawl, passing through dense woodland. Ahead, Margaret could see more uniformed men waiting where the tracks emerged into a clearing. Now, Everett said, pushing open the rear door. Sullivan went first, his military training evident as he landed with practiced efficiency despite his injured leg. Everett guided Margaret to the platform edge. Bend your knees when you land, roll with the impact, he instructed. Margaret nodded, took a deep breath, and jumped. The ground rushed up to meet her, a jarring impact followed by the controlled roll Everett had described. She came to a stop in tall grass beside the tracks, momentarily winded but uninjured. Everett landed beside her seconds later, immediately pulling her toward the tree line. Sullivan joined them, moving with surprising agility for a man with a cane. Into the woods, he directed. Stay low. They pushed through underbrush, putting distance between themselves and the tracks. Behind them, whistles and shouts indicated their absence had been discovered. They'll search outward from the train, Everett predicted, guiding them deeper into the forest. We need to circle back toward Bedford. Sullivan consulted a small compass from his pocket. This way, he indicated, setting a course roughly parallel to the tracks, but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. They moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, acutely aware of the pursuit organizing behind them. The forest grew denser, providing cover but making progress more difficult. Why would Harmon make such a public move? Margaret asked as they paused briefly to catch their breath. He's been shadowing us quietly until now. Because we're close to the destination, Sullivan reasoned. He doesn't want to just follow anymore. He wants to control what we find. Or ensure we never find it, Everett added grimly. The sound of dogs barking in the distance lent urgency to their flight. They pressed on, the afternoon light filtering through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows across their path. After nearly an hour of steady movement, Sullivan called another halt. Listen, he said, raising a hand. Through the trees ahead, the sound of running water reached them. A river or large stream. We can use that to throw off the dogs, Everett suggested. They altered course toward the sound, eventually emerging at the bank of a swift-flowing river, perhaps 30 feet across. Can you swim? Everett asked Margaret. She nodded. Her father had insisted on teaching her, despite her mother's protests about propriety. Good. We follow the current downstream a ways, then cross. Should buy us time. They waded in, the cold water a shock after their heated flight through the forest. Margaret gasped as it reached her waist, but pressed on, following Everett's lead. The current was stronger than anticipated, tugging at their legs as they moved downstream. After several hundred yards, Everett signaled it was time to cross. The crossing proved challenging, the current threatening to sweep them away at several points. But all three eventually reached the opposite bank, soaked and chilled but alive. Which way now? Margaret asked, wringing water from her skirts. Sullivan oriented himself using his compass in the position of the late afternoon sun. Bedford lies roughly northwest from here, perhaps 6 miles. He glanced at the darkening sky. We won't make it before nightfall. We need shelter, Everett agreed, scanning the tree line, and dry clothes or we risk exposure. They set off again, moving away from the river and back into the forest. The temperature was dropping with the sun, making their wet clothing increasingly uncomfortable. As twilight deepened, they stumbled upon an abandoned hunter's cabin, little more than a one-room shack with a stone fireplace and crude furnishings. But it offered shelter from the elements and concealment from pursuers. We'll rest here, Sullivan decided. Continue at first light. Everett immediately set about gathering materials for a fire, while Margaret examined the cabin's meager contents. A rough bed frame without a mattress, a wooden table with one chair, and a storage trunk that proved to contain several moth-eaten blankets. Better than nothing, she concluded, laying the blankets near the fireplace to warm, as Everett coaxed a small fire to life. Outside, night fell completely. No sounds of pursuit reached them, though whether this indicated safety or merely distance from their trackers remained uncertain. As the fire grew stronger, they took turns drying their clothing, modesty preserved through careful positioning in the cabin's deep shadows. The blankets, while musty, provided some warmth once their garments had dried sufficiently. Sullivan produced a small flask from his coat, offering it first to Margaret. Medicinal, he explained with a ghost of a smile, for the chill. The whiskey burned a path down her throat, but spread welcomed warmth through her limbs. She passed the flask to Everett, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. We should be about 10 miles from our destination, Sullivan estimated, consulting his map by firelight, assuming we've correctly identified the location from the photograph. And assuming there's still something to find after all these years, Everett added. Margaret stared into the flames, thoughts turning to her father. He wouldn't have given me the photograph if it led nowhere, she said with certainty. Whatever he created, whatever he was protecting, it's still there. The question remains, Sullivan said quietly, whether it should stay hidden. The implication hung in the air between them. Edwin Calloway had given his life to protect his research from both Redwood and, potentially, from government agents like Harmon. Perhaps the most faithful execution of his final wishes would be to ensure it remained concealed. We'll decide when we know what it is, Margaret said firmly. Not before. The men nodded agreement. The decision made, they established a watch rotation for the night. Margaret insisted on taking a turn despite their protests. I'm not a child to be protected, she reminded them. This is my father's legacy, my responsibility. Her determination won their acquiescence. Everett took first watch, positioning himself by the cabin's single window where he could observe the surrounding forest. Margaret settled onto the floor near the fire, using her folded coat as a pillow. Despite the day's exertions, sleep proved elusive. Her mind raced with questions about what tomorrow might bring, what secrets awaited discovery, and what choices she would face. Across the cabin, Sullivan had already fallen into the light sleep of a veteran soldier, present enough to wake at the first sign of danger. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his lined face, highlighting the years etched there by war in its aftermath. Her gaze shifted to Everett, silhouetted against the window. His vigilant posture reflected a man accustomed to standing between others and harm, first as a doctor, then as a protector. Whatever his personal quest for vengeance against Redwood, he had shown himself willing to risk everything for Edwin's legacy. With these thoughts circling, Margaret eventually drifted into uneasy slumber, her dreams filled with fragmented images. Her father's face, the photograph, Redwood's cold smile, Harmon's mysterious ring. She woke to Everett's hand on her shoulder, the cabin now dark except for the dying embers of the fire. Your watch, he murmured. Margaret nodded, rising silently and taking his position by the window. Outside, the forest lay bathed in moonlight, shadows stretching between trees like elongated fingers. Any signs of pursuit? She whispered. Nothing. Too quiet. Everett's expression was troubled even in the dim light. Be vigilant. As he settled into the spot she had vacated, Margaret turned her attention to the night. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the gradual movement of moonlight across the forest floor and the occasional call of a nightbird. Near the end of her watch, as false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. She stiffened, hand moving to her revolver. A deer emerged from the trees, a doe, moving cautiously into the open space around the cabin. It paused, nose testing the air, then continued its graceful progress across the clearing before disappearing into the forest on the other side. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The peaceful moment stood in stark contrast to the tension of the past days. As true dawn broke, she woke Sullivan and Everett. They broke their fast on the remaining provisions from the train, hard bread and dried beef, before preparing to depart. If we maintain a steady pace, Sullivan said as they gathered their belongings, we should reach our destination by midday. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for travel through the wooded hills of western Pennsylvania. They moved at a brisk pace, Sullivan leading with his compass and map, Everett bringing up the rear with watchful vigilance. Around mid-morning, they emerged from the forest onto a dirt road, little more than a wagon track, but a welcome alternative to pushing through underbrush. Everett's Creek should be just a few miles ahead, Sullivan announced after consulting his map. From there, we can determine the exact location of Edwin's laboratory. They followed the road, alert for any signs of other travelers. The countryside was sparsely populated, with occasional farms visible in the distance, but no indication of pursuit from either Harmon's agents or Redwood's men. "Too easy," Everett muttered as they approached a bend in the road. "We've been followed across half the country, and suddenly nothing?" As if in answer to his concern, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, approaching riders moving fast from around the bend ahead. Sullivan gestured urgently toward a cluster of rocks beside the road. "Take cover." They barely reached the shelter of the rocks before 4 riders appeared. Rough-looking men with the unmistakable bearing of hired guns. Margaret recognized Clayton Reed at their head. "Down," Everett whispered, pulling her lower behind the rocks. The riders passed without slowing, apparently unaware of their presence. Once the sound of hooves faded, Sullivan cautiously peered over their hiding place. "Heading toward the train tracks," he reported. "Looking for us where we jumped, most likely." "Which means they don't know exactly where we're headed," Margaret realized. "Yet," Everett qualified, "we need to move faster. If Reed's here, Redwood won't be far behind." They abandoned the road, cutting across country toward Everett's Creek. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, rolling hills giving way to steeper inclines as they approached the Appalachian foothills. By noon, they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley. Below, a cluster of buildings huddled beside a creek. Everett's Creek, the settlement Sullivan had identified as their last stop before the final destination. "We'll need supplies," Sullivan said, "and horses, if available." "I should go alone," Everett suggested, "less conspicuous than all 3 together." "Too risky," Margaret countered. "We stay together." Sullivan nodded agreement. "Safety in numbers, but we'll keep a low profile. No names, minimal interaction." They descended toward the settlement, which proved even smaller than expected. A general store, a livery stable, and perhaps a dozen houses scattered along the creek. No church spire or saloon, typical markers of even the smallest frontier towns. The livery stable became their first stop. The proprietor, a weathered man with a tobacco-stained beard, seemed unsurprised by strangers appearing on foot. "Folks often lose horses in these hills," he observed as Sullivan negotiated for 3 mounts. "Bears, mountain lions, or just bad luck on the trails." "Our bad luck was a washed-out bridge," Sullivan lied smoothly. "Had to abandon our wagon, walk from the crossing." The story satisfied the stable master, who provided them with 3 serviceable horses at a reasonable price. Their next stop was the general store, where they purchased provisions, additional ammunition, and a few basic medical supplies at Everett's insistence. The storekeeper was more inquisitive than the stable master, curiosity evident as he wrapped their purchases. "Don't get many travelers this time of year," he remarked. "Hunting season's not for months yet." "We're surveying," Sullivan explained, the lie coming easily. "Railroad companies considering a new spur line." This explanation provoked a flurry of questions about potential development, which Sullivan fielded with practiced diplomacy while Everett paid for their goods. As they loaded their supplies onto the horses, Margaret noticed a rider entering the far end of the settlement, a solitary figure whose posture and bearing immediately triggered recognition. "Harmon," she whispered, nodding toward the newcomer. Everett and Sullivan followed her gaze, tension visible in their postures. "He's alone," Sullivan observed. "Odd." "Or confident," Everett countered. "Time to leave." They mounted quickly, turning their horses toward the trail. As they passed the general store, Margaret risked a glance back. Harmon had dismounted and stood watching them, making no move to follow. Instead, he raised a hand in what almost seemed a salute, then turned and entered the store. "I don't understand how he keeps finding us," Margaret said, when they were safely beyond the settlement. Sullivan's expression darkened. "The telegraph office. Every town we've passed through. He's been monitoring communications, perhaps using Edwin's old network. And the military presence at the railroads," Everett added grimly. "Not government agents as we thought, but his people. He's been 3 steps ahead since Jackson Hole." They mounted quickly, turning their horses toward the trail leading out of the settlement. As they passed the general store, Margaret risked a glance back. Harmon had dismounted and stood watching them, making no move to follow or intercept. Instead, he raised a hand in what almost seemed a salute, then turned and entered the store. "What is he playing at?" Margaret wondered aloud as they put distance between themselves and Everett's Creek. "Psychological warfare," Sullivan suggested, "letting us know he's still in the game." Or he already knows where we're going, Everett said grimly, and is letting us lead the way. The possibility was unsettling. They urged their horses to a faster pace, following Sullivan's directions based on the coordinates derived from the photograph. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they left established trails for the wilderness of the Appalachian foothills. Dense forest alternated with rocky outcroppings, the horses struggling at times to find secure footing. "Should be just ahead," Sullivan announced as they approached a particularly steep hillside. According to the coordinates, Edwin's location is near the summit. They dismounted, continuing on foot as the slope grew too treacherous for riding. Margaret felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with dread. After all the danger, all the pursuit, they were finally approaching the secret her father had died protecting. Near the summit, the trees thinned, revealing a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. Sullivan consulted his compass and map one final time, then pointed toward a rocky outcropping. "There," he said with certainty. "That's the location." The outcropping appeared natural at first glance, just another formation among many in these hills. But as they approached, Margaret noticed anomalies. The rocks were arranged too regularly in places, and at the base of the largest boulder, a metal plate was embedded in the stone, nearly invisible beneath years of accumulated moss and lichen. Everett knelt beside it, carefully clearing away the growth to reveal an inscription. E.C. and D.C., July 1st, 1863. "That these dead shall not have died in vain." "Gettysburg," Sullivan murmured. "The first day of battle." Margaret traced the initials with her fingertips. "Edwin Calloway and Daniel Calloway." "And Lincoln's Gettysburg address," Everett added, indicating the quote. "Your father always admired Lincoln's words." Sullivan examined the boulder more carefully. There must be an entrance, a hidden mechanism. They searched the outcropping methodically, looking for anything unusual among the natural formations. After several minutes of frustration, Margaret's hand encountered an anomaly, a small depression in the rock face, barely large enough for fingertips. "Here," she called. "There's something." As her fingers pressed into the depression, a grinding sound emanated from within the boulder. A section of rock face swung inward, revealing a dark passage beyond. "He built it into the hillside," Sullivan said, amazement evident in his voice. "Hidden in plain sight." Everett produced a small lantern from their supplies, lighting it with steady hands. "I'll go first," he said, stepping toward the entrance. "No," Margaret stopped him with a hand on his arm. "This was meant for me. My father entrusted the key to me alone." After a moment's hesitation, Everett nodded, handing her the lantern. "We'll be right behind you." Margaret took a deep breath and stepped into the passageway. Lantern held high. The air inside was cool and surprisingly fresh, suggesting some form of ventilation. The passage extended perhaps 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. As she emerged into the space, the lantern's light revealed a sight that stopped her in her tracks. The chamber was a fully equipped laboratory, benches lined with glassware, shelves of books and journals, cabinets presumably filled with specimens and compounds. Everything was meticulously organized and, despite years of abandonment, remarkably preserved. "My God," Sullivan breathed as he and Everett joined her. "He built all this in secret?" "Not entirely in secret," came a voice from the shadows beyond the lantern's reach. "He had help." Margaret whirled toward the sound, nearly dropping the lantern. Everett and Sullivan drew their weapons in a single fluid motion. From the darkness stepped Theodore Harmon, hands raised to show he was unarmed. Behind him, another passage was visible, a second entrance they hadn't discovered. "How did you find this place?" Sullivan demanded, his revolver trained on Harmon's chest. "The same way you did," Harmon replied calmly. "Through Edwin Calloway's directions." He slowly lowered one hand to his jacket pocket, removing a photograph identical to Margaret's, but showing a different angle of the same scene. "We each had a piece of the puzzle. Edwin made sure no single person held all the knowledge." He gestured toward the passage behind him. "This second entrance was documented in my version of the photograph. Edwin designed this laboratory with multiple escape routes, knowing someday it might be compromised." Margaret stared in disbelief. "Who are you? Really?" Harmon's expression softened slightly. "A colleague of your father's. One of several who believed in his work." He gestured around the laboratory. "Who helped him create all this, away from military oversight?" "The ring," Margaret realized. It wasn't government issue. No, Harmon confirmed. It identified members of Edwin's private research circle, doctors, chemists, botanists, all dedicated to his vision of medicine beyond the battlefield. His expression softened with memory. I met Edwin in 1864 at a field hospital near Petersburg. I was a young medical assistant, horrified by our inadequate pain treatments. Your father found me experimenting with local plant compounds on wounded soldiers. Harmon twisted the ring unconsciously. Instead of reporting me, he showed me his early formulations. Said he'd been working on alternatives since Gettysburg changed him. He never mentioned you in his letters, Everett said, suspicion still evident in his voice. Security precaution, Harmon replied. After what happened with Daniel, Edwin compartmentalized everything. Each member of our circle knew only pieces of his work. He communicated through coded medical journals and seemingly routine correspondence. He looked directly at Margaret. When Lancaster was attacked, several of us received telegrams with a single word, begun. We knew immediately what it meant. Everett's weapon remained steady. Why the deception? The agents on the train? Because Redwood isn't the only threat, Harmon explained. There are elements within the government who would weaponize Edwin's research if they discovered it. I needed to ensure you reached here first, but couldn't risk being seen openly helping you. So you used us as decoys, Sullivan concluded, anger evident in his tone. Drew attention to us while you slipped through unnoticed. A necessary risk, Harmon acknowledged without apology. What matters is that we're here now and Redwood isn't. He turned to Margaret. Your father left something crucial here, something that could save countless lives. Margaret lowered the lantern slightly, studying Harmon's face for any sign of deception. What exactly was he working on? Edwin's research went far beyond what either of you knew, Harmon said, his gaze moving between Everett and Sullivan. After rejecting weapons development, he formed a secret network of physicians and botanists. I was his liaison to native healers whose plant knowledge formed the foundation of the compound. Harmon's fingers traced a row of labeled vials. What he created isn't just medicine, it's a revolution, a pain management compound that could render morphine obsolete, non-addictive, effective where all else fails. And Redwood, Margaret pressed. Harmon's expression darkened. Redwood discovered the compound's dual nature. In concentrated form, it affects the nervous system in ways that could be weaponized. The very thing your father refused to create at Gettysburg, now possible through his healing work. The irony would have destroyed him. The revelation hung in the air, its implications staggering. Margaret moved deeper into the laboratory, lantern illuminating workbenches covered with notes in her father's familiar handwriting. Journals filled shelves along one wall, their spines meticulously labeled with dates and subject matter. He documented everything, she whispered, running her fingers along the book spines. Edwin was nothing if not thorough, Sullivan agreed, lowering his weapon slightly though his gaze remained fixed on Harmon. The question remains, what do we do with all this? The rest must be destroyed, Harmon declared, producing a flask from his jacket. Coal oil. It will burn hot enough to consume everything. The voices from the main passage grew louder. Decisions had to be made in seconds, not minutes. Do it, Margaret said firmly, clutching her father's journal to her chest. He would rather see it destroyed than used for harm. Harmon worked quickly, splashing the accelerant across workbenches and bookshelves. Sullivan struck a match, hesitating only briefly before touching it to the oil-soaked surface. Flames erupted instantly, spreading with alarming speed across the laboratory. Heat and smoke filled the chamber, driving them toward the secondary exit Harmon had revealed. Just as they reached the narrow passage, a figure appeared through the thickening smoke from the main entrance. Tall and commanding, despite his years, a revolver steady in his hand. "Margaret Calloway," the man called, his voice carrying despite the crackling flames. "Your father's final betrayal." Margaret froze at the entrance to the escape tunnel. Across the burning laboratory, she found herself staring into eyes that held the same shape as her father's. Silas Redwood, once Daniel Calloway. "You're burning it all," he said, something like genuine pain crossing his weathered face. "Just like Edwin destroyed our work at Gettysburg." "You murdered my family," Margaret responded, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. A bitter smile twisted Redwood's mouth. And now you destroy his legacy. We're more alike than you know, niece. Everett stepped forward, positioning himself between Margaret and Redwood. The difference is, her choice preserves lives. Yours only takes them. A beam crashed from the ceiling, sending sparks flying. Redwood raised his arm to shield his face, and in that moment, Everett pulled Margaret into the escape tunnel. This passage leads to the other side of the ridge, Harmon explained as they fled. Our horses are waiting there. Behind them, through the narrow passage, came Redwood's voice, half muffled by the growing inferno. This isn't over, Margaret. What your father began, I will finish. The tunnel muffled the sounds of confusion and anger as Margaret, Everett, Sullivan, and Harmon emerged onto the hillside opposite from where they had entered. The narrow escape tunnel muffled the sounds of confusion and anger as Margaret, Everett, Sullivan, and Harmon emerged onto the hillside opposite from where they had entered. 4 horses stood tethered to a pine tree, laden with saddlebags and supplies. They mounted quickly, Harmon leading them down a steep trail away from the burning laboratory. We need to reach the railway station at Cumberland, he said as they rode. I have arrangements for secure transport from there. To where? Everett demanded, suspicion still evident in his tone. A private research facility in Baltimore, Harmon replied, funded by physicians and philanthropists who share Edwin's vision. His work will continue there, safely away from military or commercial exploitation. Margaret clutched her father's journal as they rode, the reality of their situation still sinking in. They had found Edwin's secret, only to destroy most of it with their own hands. Yet perhaps that had been his intention all along, to ensure his research could never be used in its entirety by any single faction. As they descended toward the valley below, a plume of smoke rose from the hillside behind them, Edwin Calloway's hidden laboratory consuming itself in purifying flame. Margaret felt a curious mixture of loss and relief watching it. Whatever secrets remained within those stone walls would never threaten humanity now. Your father would be proud, Sullivan said, noting the direction of her gaze. You've honored his legacy in the truest way possible. By destroying it? She questioned. By ensuring it serves its intended purpose, Everett corrected. Healing, not harming. Harmon nodded agreement. The journals and samples we've saved contain the essential elements of his research, enough to develop the beneficial aspects without the potential for weaponization. As they reached the valley floor, Margaret looked back one final time at the distant smoke. She thought of the photograph that had led them here. 2 brothers standing together before choices tore them apart. Edwin had made his choice at Gettysburg, choosing conscience over expediency, healing over destruction. Today, she had made the same choice. They rode hard for Cumberland, the journals and samples secure. At the station, while waiting for their train, Harmon returned from the telegraph office, his face grim yet satisfied. News from my contacts, he said, joining them at a secluded corner of the platform. Redwood was caught in the fire. His men found him trapped beneath a fallen beam in the laboratory. They managed to pull him out, but not before the flames had done their work. Is he dead? Everett asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Harmon shook his head. Live, barely, being transported to Pittsburgh for treatment. The irony isn't lost on me. He sought Edwin's pain medicine only to now desperately need it. Sullivan exhaled slowly. Justice has its own way of finding men like him. Margaret remained silent, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a strange, hollow peace. The cycle of violence that had begun at Gettysburg between 2 brothers had finally broken. 3 days later, as their train approached Baltimore, a newspaper vendor called out the day's headline, Notorious Outlaw Silas Redwood Dies of Injuries. Margaret purchased a copy. The brief article confirmed what she already sensed. Her father's brother, Daniel Calloway, had taken his secrets to the grave. That evening, in the secure laboratory Harmon had prepared, Margaret opened her father's journal. The first page bore a simple inscription. For Margaret, may you heal what we have broken. Below it, in smaller script, the future belongs to those who choose mercy over vengeance. With steady hands, she placed the vials of her father's compound on the workbench. The past was settled. Now began the work of fulfilling Edwin Calloway's true legacy, not destruction, but healing. Across the room, Everett carefully hung Rebecca's locket on a small hook beside his workstation. Their eyes met, and for the first time since they'd met, Margaret saw something beyond grief in his gaze. Not happiness, perhaps, but possibility. Behind them, fire had consumed the past. Ahead lay the promise of healing, a legacy of mercy risen from the ashes of war. In her heart, Margaret knew her father would approve.